These days, we have a profession called intimacy professional, and it's someone whose specialty is specifically to look at the processes around and the artistic creation of scenes or moments of intimacy. So a lot of people think of it as scenes of like sex and kissing and any kind of genital contact, which is very common and definitely some time that you need an intimacy professional. But we're also thinking about scenes where, like I've heard it described as moments of vulnerability, whether that vulnerability be emotional or physical. Things like giving birth, caretaking. So we are looking at moments where the actor's body and emotions are going to be, again, vulnerable, and clarity in that workspace environment helps to support the making of the art.
What additional kinds of support do intimacy professionals provide on set?
Different people are offering different kinds of specialty under the larger umbrella of intimacy. And so some of those are, first, the artistic. So this is a structured approach to creating scenes and moments of intimacy. That is choreography that tells a specific story. The actor's tools in approaching that work, whether that be the physical storytelling, the emotional storytelling, the scene analysis. We also have the administrative support, and this is much more pronounced in intimacy coordination for film, where there's quite a bit of preparation work. So phone calls, meetings, contracts that need to be drawn up ahead of time so that on the day of shooting, no one's surprised. Oh, and of course, education. So it's kind of part of artistic approach, but I think it's worth mentioning that educating in the practices of performing intimacy is a slightly different thing than doing that in the workspace.
How would you define the difference between an education piece and the artistic piece?
Well, it's a little bit like teaching dance or being a dance choreographer. There's some foundational techniques that one can be introduced to, but when I'm working as a choreographer or director, there is an element of instruction, but I'm going to offer suggestions and offer notes really differently when I'm educating as opposed to when I am directing.
Sounds like you're wearing a lot of hats when you when you step into this role as an intimacy professional. Like, it's not just one thing that you're doing. How do you keep a hard line between those kinds of roles, or do you? Is it always something that permeates back and forth?
I mean, to me, so much of the role of an intimacy director, as well as a fight director, honestly, is collaborating with the existing culture of that rehearsal. Some folks are strictly mental health support. Some folks are more strictly choreography and acting coaching. Because those varying specialties are necessary in different amounts in different rehearsal spaces. But to answer your question of how do you keep those roles from cross-pollinating? Sometimes it's tough because you see a movement where you're like, oh, I don't agree necessarily with that choreography, but that's also part of the job, is that it's not about what the choreographer wants. It's about what the piece requires. So that's why it's so important to be a collaborator in the space and not to enforce one's own artistic impression onto the room, but to be a support within the room.
Do you have a team of intimacy professionals that you work with when you go on to set, be it in film, TV, or in theater?
So when it comes to theater, I'm generally working solo. When it comes to working on set, though, it has, from my experience and from what I have observed and heard from some of my colleagues, it is a stronger position to work in groups. There's a lot to do for each of these roles. There's also a lot of like education and advocacy. Some sets you're working on, people have never heard of an intimacy coordinator, or they've never worked with one, or they're dubious of the role. So there is sometimes educating, sometimes advocating, sometimes I say maybe defending, where some folks are actually openly hostile towards the role. So it's really helpful to have someone who can be there to support the actors while the other person is doing some of the other work that has to happen on set.
The work goes well beyond just instances of violent, intimate contact and stuff like that, right? But that's part of it as well. So I can see that being incredibly problematic and traumatizing going by these older models of like, yeah, just go figure it out, or if it's being improvised every single night, let alone the fact that you're being watched by a room full of strangers while this very, again, intimate act is happening, right?
Yeah. And in some cases, like happening to you, as opposed to you being an active and engaged participant in the creation of art. So yeah, the necessity of an intimacy professional does have a lot to do with establishing those respectful workplaces practices, discussions of consent, boundaries and parameters. But I do foresee a day coming really soon where the idea of respectful workplaces is something that we are all responsible for. I need to advocate for myself. It's also important that I listen to what my castmates need and what my workmates need so that I can be an active participant in a joyful workspace. It's not just on one person to create that. It's for all of us to do our own work and to do our homework so we can show up with curiosity and openness, prepared to be trusting and trustworthy as we develop a workspace together that is conducive to the kind of work we want to make.
It's really lovely, the sentiment of being trusted and trustworthy. I think is a really, really beautiful sentiment.